When the united front between the Communist Party of China and the Guomindang collapsed in the early months of 1927, it prompted a heated theoretical debate amongst Marxists around the world to identify what had gone wrong and how best to move forward. A key element of this debate concerned the very nature of Chinese society and how best to apply traditional Marxist concepts to situations widely outside the scope of Marx's own investigations. Was China feudal? One of the first things that everybody learns in classes about Marxism is that Marx laid out 5 stages of historical development, or modes of production, that all civilizations must pass through. Primitive communism, slave society, feudalism, capitalism, and communism. And where China fit on this path was of more than academic interest. Pragmatically, depending on the stage of society China was in, different revolutionary strategies might work. Originally, when the United Front was founded on the Comintern's insistence in 1921, China's mode of production went largely undiscussed. With the closest thing the CCP had to a party line coming from the theorist Li Da, who asserted that China had entered into the age of industrial revolution and been integrated into the capitalist world, but was not itself a developed capitalist country. The debate really began not in China, but in the Soviet Union. The Comintern's United Front policy was supported in Moscow by Stalin, and when it began to falter, Leon Trotsky saw the United Front as a perfect issue with which to challenge Stalin's leadership and understanding of Marxist theory. Trotsky and his followers pointed to the development of China's urban, coastal cities, and the economic influence those cities held over the countryside, to argue that China was already capitalist. So an alliance with the capitalist forces of the Guomindang against feudal warlordism was foolish and self-defeating. Karl Radek, a theorist aligned with Trotsky, took an historical angle to the argument. He argued that through the free transaction of land and money, feudalism had eroded in China during the Qin and Han dynasties, and so China had had a form of commercial capitalism for 2,000 years, before beginning to transition to industrial capitalism after the Opium War. This historical argument opened the floodgates for every theorist in the socialist world to present their own analysis of Chinese history. And to understand them, we first have to examine one of the more enigmatic Marxist concepts. So we have our 5 stages of Marxism: primitive communism, slavery, feudalism, capitalism, and communism. But there's one more you may have heard of: the Asiatic mode of production. What the hell is that? Does it fit between 2 of those stages? Is it a whole separate thing? Or maybe a subset of one of the others? Unfortunately, Marx and Engels only touched on the category briefly, and while they discussed certain features common to it, they never gave a full definition. Marx characterizes Asiatic or Oriental society as lacking private property, with an omnipotent authoritarian state, ruling a people who lived communally with no real social dynamism. Nowadays, we can see these analyses falling into the old racist tropes of a static despotic East versus a dynamic and progressive West, as well as relying upon a lot of purely incorrect information. In the 20s and 30s, Marxist theorists had learned enough about non-European societies to realize that having a single category just for not Europe was pretty problematic. The biggest defenders of the Asiatic means of production were the Hungarians Ludwig Magyar and Evgenia Varga, and they argued that it was not unique to Asia, but was a stage that all societies had passed through at one point. Nevertheless, the Comintern felt threatened by the idea of regionally specific modes of production, since they called into question the entire purpose of a communist international. And so at a conference on the topic in 1931, the Asiatic means of production was officially repudiated by the Comintern. This view of China as Asiatic was never popular in China itself, but many other views were. It was generally accepted that China had been either feudal or a slave society during the Zhou dynasty, but that something changed with the consolidation of the imperial system during the Qin and Han dynasties 2,000 years ago. Either it changed from slavery to feudalism, or from feudalism to semi-feudalism, proto-capitalism, or something unique. The something unique position was mostly held by theorists of the left-wing Guomindang. Although the parties had divided, These people did generally consider themselves to be Marxists. However, they felt that the goal of the nationalist revolution should be to install a government that could lay the foundation for true socialism by advancing China's industrial sector and developing its productive forces. Their most prestigious theorist, Tao Xisheng, held that feudal forces still controlled China's ideological superstructure, but that as an economic base, feudalism had died and China had been in a long transitional system ever since. He felt that China had an ambiguous class structure that left no class dominant, and while the remaining feudal forces must be the target of the revolution, the left GMD disagreed with the Communist Party over what counted as feudal. To the left GMD, feudal forces referred specifically to the warlords keeping China divided and nothing else. The faction influenced by Trotsky was known as the oppositionists in China, or the liquidationists, for their hard line of the national bourgeois. While only some oppositionists believed China had been some form of capitalist since the Han Dynasty, all agreed that it had quickly become capitalist after the Opium War in 1840. Imperialism dominated China's urban areas and was penetrating the interior. Imperialism was the highest form of capitalism, and capitalism's historical mission was to destroy feudalism. Therefore, feudalism must have been destroyed. They argued that feudal societies were self-sufficient, with only incidental market involvement, and they vehemently opposed the concept of hybrid or transitional categories as being undialectical. If several forms existed in a society, it was the job of Marxists to identify the leading one. The most important element of the Trotskyist critique was that China's local bourgeois should not be distinguished from the foreign imperialist bourgeois. Both were in alliance against the proletariat, and were the targets of the revolution. As such, the United Front, an alliance of the proletariat with the Guomindang, the party of the national bourgeois, had been foolish from the beginning. In China there are no noble lords standing in opposition to the bourgeoisie. Unless one is playing with words, there is no feudalism in China. The attempt to create feudalism in China relies not on facts, but on the naked desire to justify collaboration with the bourgeoisie. The Comintern and the CCP responded to these criticisms with a much more detailed argument in favor of China having been a slave society, then transitioning to a feudal mode of production under the Han Dynasty. They acknowledged that superficially China looked very different from medieval Europe, but they argued that the base exploitative structure was the same. CCP theorists asserted that imperialism had developed capitalism in China's coastal cities, but such development was only beginning to penetrate into the interior. Rather, in the villages, imperialism was destroying the feudal superstructure, but supporting and perpetuating feudalism itself. The economic life of the Chinese village is still based for the most part on feudal relations. The bulk of the land is in the hand of landlords who live on the produce of their tenants. The rents are not fixed, and tenant rights are not granted for long terms. On the average, the tenant receives only about 50% of his produce. In addition, the peasants are constantly summoned together at the convenience of the landlords, militarists, and bureaucrats, who hold all the political power in the village, and are made to disgorge all sorts of taxes and imposts. Furthermore, a considerable portion of the land is held in common by the village or owned by temples. In addition, primitive capitalist modes of exploitation have also penetrated into the village, so that the peasants are exposed to a double type of exploitation. For these reasons, the CCP declared that China was a semi-feudal, semi-colonial nation. As such, the target of the revolution must be both feudal forces and imperialists. But unlike the left GMD, the Communist Party defined feudal forces as both warlords and landlords. And unlike the oppositionists, the CCP considered the Chinese bourgeoisie a neutral class, neither a target nor an ally. The debate over China's mode of production is ongoing, albeit in a much different form. One key problem today that didn't factor into the argument at the time is that feudalism itself is a pretty unpopular term with modern medievalists. It's generally accepted that the traditional view of the feudal social structure is a vast oversimplification that didn't really exist in Europe, much less outside of it. But it's important to recognize that the Marxist concept of feudalism is not the same thing as the medieval historian's concept of feudalism. But the term still does carry some baggage. At the same time, many modern Marxists have rejected viewing history in terms of these broad stages, instead arguing that we should look at all societies as progressing along their own lines. In Marx at the Margins, Kevin Anderson even argues that it was this multilinear approach that Marx was trying to get at when he talked about the Asiatic means of production. Against these critiques, I would argue in favor of Egyptian Marxist Samir Amin's view of a more generalized, unilinear development. Amin puts forward 4 necessary stages of historical development: primitive communism, the tributary mode of production, capitalism, and communism, each of which has an unstable transitional stage between them. The tributary mode of production is intentionally broad, including all societies with developed productive forces but not machines, with non-productive activities corresponding to a surplus in production, divided into social classes, and with a developed state transcending the local village. Within the tributary mode are many variations, including feudalism and slavery, and whether or not a society is peripheral or central changes what these stages look like. Amin considers China to have had the prototypical central tributary system, as its surplus value was centralized by the state, whereas peripheral tributary systems had their surplus value monopolized by local actors. Amin defends the need to develop broad theories as necessary. Some people regard this mode as a useless oversimplification, and insist on the need to locate in time and space the specific features of each pre-capitalist society. This is an example of how difficult dialogue is between historians, concerned to apprehend history in all its concrete details, and non-historians. The latter are perhaps too often in a hurry to generalize, to formulate so-called theories and laws, but the former suffer from empiricism and lack of perspective. What kind of progress can we make toward understanding social laws if we insist on defining 100, 200, 500 modes of production? In the 1940s, the CCP's view of a semi-feudal, semi-colonial China came to dominate. The more successful the Communist Party was, the more self-evident it was that its strategy, and therefore the theory that informed its strategy, must be correct. And in aligning myself with Amin's view, I don't want to imply that I think the CCP's line was wrong, rather that I think Amin provides more precise language with which to talk about it.